Andrew asked if we could do an in-depth discussion on a topic of nominalism and realism versus objectivism.
So there was something that was as I was catching up in the few weeks that I had to miss. It's in the paragraph that straddles page 111, 112. Peikoff says, there is a metaphysical basis for concepts. There is something the same in reality about the units of a concept, their characteristics, which differ in various instances only in regard to their measurements. This is a fact about the concrete, not a creation of man. We can integrate perceptual entities into a mental unit only because these entities actually possess the same characteristics. We can treat existence as the same in a specified respect only because they are the same in that respect. That at least seems like he's saying that there is some kind of similarity in reality that is forming the basis of our decision to treat things as the same. Now, I don't want to quote him out of context, like he was warning about in this section, but didn't it sound like he's saying we treat things like they're the same because they are the same?
Sure, he says that these things are,
and
they are the samely.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that similarity exists except for as a relationship among the characteristics of objects.
Yeah.
So
okay.
I'm not sure.
Well, it just seemed like maybe I was taking that out of context, but I guess he's saying that all it is that there is a sort of similarity. I guess that paragraph sounded a little bit like the Aristotelian version of realism to me, where he like the quality or the essence was in the instance as opposed to in some other world. But I think he's just saying that each existence, each unit has a quality to it, and the qualities really are the same as another instance. So maybe I was overreading that.
Well, anytime you have descriptions of qualities or similarities, that can be read in two different senses. You could read it in the sense that the objectivists intend to read it, which is this is an abstraction or a reification, and we recognize that it's a reification.
Yeah.
Versus you could read it in a different way if you wanted to, but I don't agree with that other way of reading it.
Okay.
Are you talking about the top of page 112?
Yeah.
It's funny because I came in prior to you saying where you were at, but I went to that page. Obviously, I wasn't here during that discussion last week, but here's this is from years ago when I first read this. I don't know if you can see, I've got like all kinds of underlines and circles and everything in that paragraph.
Yeah.
Along the same lines of thought.
There was something else that he said in this section. I was listening to this on Audible and I noticed it. He's saying that the concepts do not pertain to consciousness. This is on 111. Consciousness alone or existence alone. They are products of a specific kind of relationship between the two. And then the next paragraph is contrasting to realism, and he says, or at least that's I think how he frames it. He says, on one hand, there is a uniquely human contribution to the conceptual level of awareness. In contrast to perception, conceptualization is not an automatic reaction to stimuli. It is not a passive gazing that awaits the infallible imprinting on the mind of some external entity. And I guess this is where I've had a problem with Peikoff's framing of the issue, is that he's trying to go against realism, but the thing that he's criticizing is a bad way of forming a concept or a bad epistemology, which doesn't seem like that's the exact issue. It seems like the issue is there something there intrinsic in the thing itself? And instead of attacking that idea, he attacks a mystic way of getting to that idea.
He's speaking in a broad brush right there. So whenever he's getting polemical against other views, he's not necessarily representing the best proponents of that view. He's representing what he takes it to be the general reception of that idea. It's just, those sections are not academic. Those sections are polemical.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I don't necessarily want to fault Peikoff or Rand for that, because it's true that throughout history, most adherents to the metaphysical idea of realism have also been epistemological mystics.
Yeah.
And so I don't blame them to a certain extent for packaging those together, especially in a non-academic context. But I think it is helpful and important to point out that I am not aware, either in Rand or Peikoff or any other objectivist literature, of any objections against the metaphysical position of realism that are not actually objections to some mystical form of epistemology. So I'm not aware of them ever explicitly accurately identifying the metaphysical position of realism as distinct from an epistemological approach, and then having an argument against that metaphysical position of realism. That's not to say that therefore the metaphysical position of realism is accurate or true. It just means that, to my knowledge, I don't think they have an argument against it.
Well, so I guess I understand, because that's kind of how what we were saying about the Sermon on the Mount comment, that like it's unfortunate that he used that example, but it's understandable given probably Peikoff's whole life experience with the Sermon on the Mount. People probably quoting it as like exactly what he's characterizing it as. He's probably only heard Christians use it in that sense. So I can see where you're coming from there. I guess here's how I've thought a lot of the challenge on this topic is just figuring out how to frame it. And what I was asking you earlier, Jacob, was would we all agree that the way to answer the metaphysical question of universals, or whether there is a metaphysical abstract object, the way that you would answer that question is to say, are there facts of reality that would necessitate that belief? Because what I like in your article, Jacob, I think you had an argument or a couple comments that were to say, if there is no abstract object, then it's hard to know exactly what we're talking about, or there was maybe a consequence of that you were saying, like it would be like a bad consequence if there were no metaphysical universals. But in terms of forming that concept, would you agree that that's where you would need to start?
Yeah, and as we've talked about other ways of framing the issue, I think one other way to frame it in an objectivist terminology might be the question of whether, so objectivists would say that they are the same as viewed by human consciousness, or something to that extent, as viewed by man's consciousness. And I think the question, to put it in that terminology, is would they be the same as viewed by any consciousness? Is it just human consciousness that happens to view them as the same, and some other type of consciousness could possibly view them as completely different? Some other type of consciousness could view dog and woman as the same, but man as fundamentally different from the two? Is that the case? And I think the answer, obviously, we want to say is no, that it should be that those things are the same in reality as viewed by any potential consciousness.
But why would you frame it as viewed by any consciousness? Because I'm
just using, because objectivists want to focus on using that terminology, and so I'm just sort of granting that terminology. Saying if you want to insist on using that terminology when talking about these types of things, then that would be one way to get at the essential issue, using that same terminology.
Well, I agree with what you're saying, Jacob. I think that that's the right way to address the issue. So So you make a good point that if the similarities, if it's valid for human beings to look at two things as opposed to a third thing and say that there's similarities, then it would also be valid for God to look at and do the same process, or for an angel to do it, or for a Martian to do it, because there really are, in the case of, say, three trees, and we could say that two of them are similar in height, there really is a tree that when somebody counts the amount of feet, this one really is, say, 17, this one really is 18, and that one really is 30. Like, this is because of a fact about the trees themselves, that when somebody goes to measure it, they will get 17 units versus 18 units versus 30 units. That's true whether or not somebody ever comes and measures them. It's like the tree in the forest doesn't make a sound even though no one hears it fall. Yes, it makes a sound. If you conceptualize sound as being waves rather than as being a human experience of waves, it just depends on how you frame it. And so we can say that the fact that the tree makes the sound that's in reality, as long as we agree to frame it that way and not talk about sound as perception, but sound as waves. That said, the concept of similarity arises because we have observed ourselves making observations. We have observed ourselves going and doing a specific process by which we make determinations about things, and we say this is 17, this is 18. That's why we have the concept of similarity. And so I think that what they're doing is pointing out that similarity refers to a consciousness perceiving three different things and saying something about two of them in respect to the third. That's when we say what similarity is. We mean there is a consciousness doing it. It's an action.
I guess I just don't. I appreciate the exploration of substituting any other consciousness in for human consciousness, but I do think that the question is slightly more fundamental than that, because we're kind of saying, is there something that I'm observing using my conceptual faculty? Is there an object of that conceptualizing process that is not one of the units? And if so, if there is an abstract object, what reason do we have for believing that it exists? And that really is what it comes down to for me. There are other ways to come at it that I think are helpful, but I do think that's a fundamental. And maybe you disagree. Maybe you think that's not fundamental to it. But
you're asking whether there are abstract objects, and in what sense do we mean they are? What sense do we mean they are real? That's the question that we're all discussing, right?
Yeah. And so what I'm saying, what I'm proposing is, if we're going to answer the question, are there abstract objects? We need to, and specifically metaphysical universals. If the answer is yes, then why should I think that? Why should we think that there are? What reason do we have for thinking that?
Is that Isaac? Go ahead. You don't have to raise your hand, Isaac.
Isn't God an abstract object?
I don't think so.
No.
I think he's a particular. It doesn't mean that he's a physical being, but that which is either a physical object or that which is a consciousness, those two things would all be particulars.
No. Like, I have an idea in my head about something, and that's not physical. My idea is not physical, but my idea is an instance.
I have a lot of notes on this topic. Andrew, if you're interested, I could share some. I don't know if it helps.
Sure, yeah. I'm kind of curious to know what Jacob's answer would be to that.
Go ahead.
So to put it just real plainly and simply, which is to put it probably no differently than the article that you're referencing, Andrew, is yes, I think there has to be abstract objects, or another way of saying it, metaphysical similarity prior to and apart from any consciousness, in order for any potential consciousness to be justified in ascribing similarity in their conceptual faculty, right? Because otherwise, there is no basis in reality for ascribing similarity to the things that we do ascribe similarity to, right? So that there's consciousness ascribing similarity, but on what basis does consciousness ascribe similarity? If it's got a basis in reality, then there has to be similarities in reality, or metaphysical similarities, if you want to put it that way. And when you cash that out, that becomes abstract objects.
I would answer your question by saying that the basis in reality is the objects and their qualities. So, for instance, trees have height, they have magnitude, or what's the word that Locke uses? Extension. Trees have extension. But when we say that trees have extension, what we are saying is that the tree is this much. That's all we mean.
Yeah.
And so the basis of saying that these trees are similar is these two, as opposed to a third one, are extended in a way that is in a way that is more like each other than it is like the third. That's what we mean when we say similarity. So I'm not sure why we have to say that there is an abstract object called similarity or something like that, or even an abstract object called height. It's just a characteristic of objects.
So think about two trees that are exactly the same height in comparison to a third that isn't the same height as the other two. Is it true in reality that they share the exact same height? However you want to break that down, they share the same measurement of extension, or however you want to break that down. The point is that there is a sameness in reality prior to and apart from any consciousness.
Yes, I would say in reality they have the same height.
And then that same height, let's call it 6 foot tallness, it is a thing in reality. It's not a particular, it's not a thing in the same sense that the individual trees are things. And it's not a thing in the same sense that my hand is a thing, but it's still something in reality to which we can refer with justification. And if it wasn't something in reality to which we could refer, then we wouldn't be justified in referring to it.
So I agree that it's a quality and it's real.
So yes, it's a real quality, and it's a real quality which the two particulars have in common.
So I would say this is almost the same thing, but the way I would say it is that it's a quality that each one of the particulars have, or it's an aspect of the particulars. And then when you want to say that they have it in common, that's the part where I would qualify. And I would just say that they differ from a third object in the same way. That's what we mean when we say they have it in common.
Each particular has the same quality.
But
The quality of the one is identical to the quality of the other.
But when we say the quality is, I just want to make sure that, so this is coming out from the objectivist interpretation, is I would not say the quality is unless I was using that in the reified sense of the term is. The object is, and it is in such a manner that it possesses such and such quality. So I wouldn't say that the quality exists. I would say the object exists bearing qualities, which means almost like qualitatively. Somebody runs quickly. You could say that the person is running, and you could say that there's quickly, but quickly means how they're running, and running means how they're acting. But really all we're talking about is the person, and I don't see why we have a need to. I mean, this is Occam's razor. I don't see why we need to posit that quickly is a thing, or that quickness is a thing, or that running is a thing.
Well, let's say that I say that Cody is running quickly, And in that instance, I'm referring to him sprinting. And in another instance, I say Cody is running quickly. And in that instance, I'm referring to him crawling or walking very slowly, right? So if we're not going to say that quickliness is a real quality, then there's no basis on which we can claim or call foul when you equivocate like that. That there has to be a real quality of quickliness in order to justify using that term for the same type of thing and differentiating it from other things. If it doesn't have an identity in reality, then you have no basis for calling foul when somebody equivocates.
Well, the object is in reality, so that's why we say it has a basis in reality. But like let's say there's two babies that are crawling and one crawls more quickly than the other. It's all relative. And that doesn't make me a relativist, but like literally there are to say that something is quick is to compare it to other objects that are less quick. Like you don't have there's no referent to the word quick unless you're referring it to other objects.
So I don't disagree with that. In order for quickliness to be instantiated in reality, an object has to, a particular has to instantiate it. The point is that there are some things that it would be inappropriate to call quickly, right? Some things that are actually slowly as opposed to quickly.
I don't think so.
Given a certain context.
Well, okay, so yeah, given a context where you're referring to multiple objects.
Yeah, so I mean, narrow it to whatever field you want. The point is that whatever. So instead of using a vague term like quickly, use a more precise term like traveling at 5 feet per secondly.
Right. So it's all relational. It's all in relation to the turning of the Earth around the sun, and in relation to a certain amount of space.
Yeah,
you can't like there could be an ant that is walking on the ground, and I could say he's fast or slow relative to the cheetah or relative to a snail.
If we change the quality from quickly to, I don't know if this would be a quality, but what about image of God? Is that a quality that exists in reality, or is that not real?
That's a quality. It means that we bear a set of qualities that God also has, or at least that are analogously that God has.
Did you have something to elaborate on with that, Isaac?
Does that make sense I don't know how to articulate it in this discussion very well, but wouldn't that be like, you guys are talking about quickliness? What about image of godliness? Are there just particulars of image of God, or does image of God actually exist?
My read on that would be that there are particulars that exist in a way that displays a characteristic. And the characteristic would be, for instance, rationality or capacity to take action, to make choices, those kinds of things. All of that, these are the characteristics. They are the mode of being. They're the way of being.
So
Yeah.
Cody, let me ask you a direct question. Does quickliness exist?
Only in the extended sense of the term existence. So just like redness exists in an extended sense. So the way I'd characterize it is that nouns exist, verbs are characteristics of nouns, adverbs are characteristics of verbs, and so they exist in only the extended sense. You can say they exist, but as long as you tag it mentally with the fact I am making a reification here.
So, and you would give the same answer if I asked you if image of godliness exists.
Yeah, or godliness, or whatever whatever term, whether it be holiness or any of these other abstract terms that we often use.
I think I see what you're saying, like this idea, okay, godliness, holiness, like everybody manifests that to varying degrees and to different extents and in different ways in their lives, I guess. But like, I tend to think of image of God as an actual thing.
Like as if it's like a badge?
I don't know if it's a badge, but
You could call it a set of characteristics.
Yeah, it's hard for me to articulate things very well in this discussion because I feel like I speak more colloquially, and that just ends up making it confusing for you guys. So I try not to speak too much, but I'm just trying to relate it back to things in our Christian worldview that I think we take as true, but we're not, like in the realm of this discussion, we're not having, it feels like we're not bearing the full weight on those things. So for me, that's like, well, okay, what about image of God? What about, and this is what I was getting at earlier, what about even the concept of God? I've never met God in reality. It's a concept God is a concept in my mind. So far as I know God in my mind.
And for a lot of people, God is a floating abstraction. So then that's something that Jacob is like, he's railed about on a lot of our podcasts. Is people are treating God like a floating abstraction. So Isaac, I think that's really smart that you're asking that question. And I also, okay, so here's a thought experiment that will help you pursue this path. Ask yourself whether evil exists. And if you're familiar with the Reformed theory of what evil is, evil as privation, you'd realize that no, evil does not exist. It's not a thing.
Right, but you can still call things evil.
Right. And in a lot of people's imagination, evil is like this dark cloud, like in the Neverending Story, that is sweeping through the land. But that's not what evil actually is. And it's not a force. It's not like this mystical force like in Star Wars. Like there's the powers of good versus evil fighting each other as if they are actual things. Evil does not exist in the sense that Satan exists or God exists. It's a characteristic of certain kinds of actions or people.
Also, my thoughts on your questions, Isaac, is that Cody could be like, Cody's position doesn't entail that, it doesn't necessarily entail anything bad about the image of God. He's just saying, if Cody's right, then what we would say is creatures exist, you exist in a way that bears the image of God, but we just aren't going to say that the image of God is one abstract universal object. It can sound like we're saying, it can sound like Cody is saying that these abstract things aren't real, like they're false, but that's not what he's saying.
Yeah, let me just clarify real quick. I don't think anybody's saying anything like, bad or whatever. I'm just trying to lay a bear trap. No, I'm just trying to use logic, like within the logic of this discussion and bearing it on our Christian ideas. Yeah. Because I feel like for me, that's where it really, like, where the rubber meets the road. When we talk about quickliness or whatever it is, I'm just like, yeah, I see what Cody's saying, but I also see what Jacob's saying. And I'm like, they both kind of make sense to me. And it's hard for me to really tease out what what's wrong here. For me, like, things kind of I tend to lean more towards image of God is real. So that's why I'm like trying to bear weight on examples in that realm within this discussion.
So if godliness is a real thing in that sense, then do we also say that something like capitalism is a real thing, like it's an abstract object? That's where I would go if I were trying to deconstruct this position. Is I'd say, now, what do you mean when you say that capitalism is an abstract object? Or what would you mean if you said that goodness is an abstract object? I don't know what that even means.
So I want to come back to something that Jacob, that you were saying earlier, because I kind of keep getting hung up on this because it feels like, I shouldn't say feels like, as far as I'm aware, if you say, if there's no abstract object, then we wouldn't be justified in then about predicating something about a class of things. Is that it? If that's true, is that enough for us to believe that there is an abstract object? Because it seems like you're still just saying, here's what would be true, here's what would happen if it wasn't true. But is that, it's kind of like David Paulman has said before. Sometimes people will say, well, if that's true, then we can't know anything. But it's like, it'd be much better to say why we can know something rather than just the consequence of not being able to say something is true. So maybe you think that maybe it's your position that this consequence of there not being abstract objects is enough for us to believe that there are abstract objects, but I'm not seeing how that gets us to that point.
Yeah, so I think it's just something that is more assumed, similar to the law of non-contradiction, in that, and a lot of times the best way to demonstrate to other people the truthfulness of the law of non-contradiction is to say, well, if it wasn't true, then you'd run into all these problems, right? It's easier to demonstrate it that way than to potentially get into the weeds of, describing the axiomatic nature of it and things like that.
Okay.
I'm not sure that I'm going to claim that the truthfulness of abstract objects is a axiom. Maybe it is in some way. I haven't thought too much about that. But that would be the main reason why I approach it that way, is because it's a little bit easier or cleaner in terms of demonstrating or communicating it to other people, because it's not something that you can just point to and say, look, there it is.
Yeah.
It's similar to logic in that sense, in that it's an invisible reality that just has to be assumed in order for us to make sense of anything that we want to make sense of.
Okay.
That actually is a different point of disagreement that I have with Jacob, I think, is how to validate logic. But I don't know if we talked about that in the past, but it's I just want to mention that there is ongoing disagreement, or discussion at least, that Jacob and I had about whether the ground of all of our knowledge is in fact simply observation, and whether logic can be understood as just observation, whether or on the other hand, whether logic and observation together, I think this is Jacob's position, form the two foundational pieces. Is that correct, Jacob?
Yes, I think so. Okay. And having given just slightly a bit more thought to your previous question, Andrew, I think the way that I would put it is not so much that we wouldn't be able to justify something if abstract objects didn't exist. I think the positive way to put it is just that's what it means to justify our claims about similarity, or that's what it means to justify our concepts as based in reality. To say that those things are the same while denying that there is a metaphysical quality which they share in common seems meaningless. Yeah. That seems like an incoherent way of saying something. So in my mind, that's just what we mean when we say those things are the same, is that in reality, they share a common characteristic.
Yeah. I got it. That definitely helps. Cody, I remember I did talk with Jacob about this issue of the foundations. And the way he explained it to me helped me make some sense of the difference, and at least why that's his position. And Jacob, what you used that was helpful to me was, you said you can validate A is A without any content to A is A. Like, just by reflection, just by introspection, you can know that it doesn't matter what you fill in the blank there, it will be the same. You don't actually have to wait. Like David Paulman said in his debate with Seth Bloomsburg, he said, maybe one day I will find a contradiction. I don't think you have to do that. I think you can say, Cody, this is where objectivism would be in line with what Jacob's saying is, you can't get to the idea of identity unless you've observed a bunch of instances. But once you have, you can reflect on that. And you're not just saying, well, everything that I've seen happens to also be itself and not something contradictory at the same time. So I will make a little bit of a logical leap and say, I'm going to treat everything as if it is the same. You can actually just take all content out of the construction, blank is blank, and you can know with certainty that no matter what you put there, it will be true. And that's why that's different from every other induction that we do, because everyone at one point thought that all swans were white, but then you find a black swan and then you adjust your knowledge contextually. And that's the great thing about Peikoff, is that he gives you that, he kind of allows you in a sense to say, we can adjust our knowledge contextually, but that will never happen with logic. And I can say that with 100% certainty, because that you can justify that as its own basis.
Yes, you're describing the idea of induction through enumeration. That's the black swan instance, and that's why it failed, is because you cannot. And the only way that you can successfully create an induction through enumeration is if you have exhaustive knowledge of the entire field. Whereas there are some inductions that you can perform on the basis of only a single instance. And it's not by the means of induction through enumeration. It's induction in a different sense. And in the way that I would account for that is when I realize as a small child or a baby that a thing is something, I've just come to an understanding of what it means to be something. I now have an understanding of isness. And once you have that understanding, you understand that it's going to apply wherever it's going to apply. So I think that we do come to this logical induction in order. Well, I'm not sure if induction is the applicable term, but whatever it is, it's a process similar to induction by which we come to understand that that things are what they are. But there is a disagreement somewhere in the way that I account for that. We don't have to necessarily tease it out right now, but I think there is a distinction there between how I would understand grounding our concept of the law of identity. I think there just may be a difference somewhere. I saw you had your hand raised, Jacob.
Yeah, so I agree. We're not gonna exhaust this issue here. But I will say what Andrew said was a accurate description of my view. However, I do want to add a qualification, maybe two qualifications, that would distinguish my view from the views which many objectivists are rightly wanting to distance themselves from, right? Because there are people who hold my view along with some other bad views that objectivists want to distance themselves from, and I think rightfully so. So the one qualification is that when I say that logic is a separate foundation from observation or empirical perception, I'm strictly, very, very strictly referring to the formulation A is A, with zero content, with zero particular content. Whereas many other people who would affirm what I affirm about the distinction between logic and perception would try to pack in all kinds of content into that. They would try to say, married bachelor is true apart from any perception, and that type of thing. So I want to stress, no, it's very, very strictly just A is A, and apart from that, there's combinations of logic and perception that go into justifying things like there are no married bachelors, there are no square circles, things like that. So that's one qualification. Another qualification is I agree with Cody and Objectivists that I don't think, or at least I'm pretty confident that a human being in their perceptual or in their conceptual development wouldn't be able to conceptualize the formula A is A prior to or apart from perceptual data. I think the perceptual data helps you to exercise the muscles, so to speak, to get to the point where you can reach a knowledge that A is A. The only differentiation from me and Objectivist is potentially that the justification for A is A is not grounded in the perception. You needed the perception to get there sort of chronologically or experientially, but the justification for it in terms of epistemology isn't through the perception, if that makes sense.
I'm understanding what you're saying. That is similar to the way Plato understands how concepts form. Do you agree with that assessment?
No, I'm not sure what you mean, because my understanding of Plato is that he thinks that concepts are remembering things from a past life.
And that the reason why we come to remember them is because we are reminded of them by our observations of something. So I guess the point is that it sounds like you have the same overall approach as Plato does on that one topic.
No, because I don't think that he is saying that the justification for the concepts is the past life. I don't know what he would say the justification is. He might have something completely different in mind. But the distinction that I'm making is strictly about the epistemological justification, because I would agree with Objectivists that you couldn't even form concepts apart from perception. And the whole process of concept formation is grounded in perception. So I agree with Objectivists there. The issue is on the epistemological ground for logic specifically. On that note, I do have to go here in a minute. If anybody has anything they want to tie up, or obviously this is going to be an ongoing conversation.
So there's one thing that you just said that I would want to make sure I understand what you're implying. And I want to ask if this is how you see it. You distinguish between the epistemological justification for the idea and the process by which people come to know the idea. And I think that the Objectivists would hold that there is, I have a child here, they would hold that those two things are the exact same thing. Showing how an idea developed is showing the epistemological justification. Whereas I think you might disagree with that.
I think Objectivists would actually disagree with that when pressed, though, because I don't think that they would say that the justification for the concept that they're using has to be traced back through the exact perceptual steps that they themselves went through. Right? That they would just say that it has to be traced back through similar perceptual steps, regardless of the content, and that's why it's able to be sort of universalized. So I think that there's a little bit more to it than that, and I think that when pressed, Objectivists would probably not be as rigid in saying that the exact way that the concept was formed is identical to the justification for it.
Yeah, that's fair. You just have to be able to show that it's reducible, that it is not, but that doesn't mean that that's the order that you learned it, because you often learn from other people.
Yeah, and so I think I would say, just as there's somewhat of a distinction there, specifically with the proposition A is A, it is not justified in the same way that it is discovered.
Okay, that's interesting. There's my kid. Hey, come on in. Say hello.
Hey, Dagny.
This is Dagny Leibold. So anyway, what you just pointed out there, that could be worth further exploration, I would think.
Maybe we can pick up there next time.
Cool. See you, Jacob.